Since we're building a real-world website, we need to think about responsive web design principles from the very beginning, even if we initially build and test for big screens. So these principles are really ingrained in the entire development process. And so therefore, before we actually start building the site, let's quickly learn what responsive design is all about. So responsive design, or responsive web design, as it's been more traditionally called, is essentially a technique that we can use to make a web page adjust its layout and its visual style to any possible screen size. And with screen size, we don't just mean the entire screen of the device that it's been used to consume the page, but it might also just be the window or the viewport size of the browser. So in practice, this means that responsive web design makes websites usable on all devices. So no matter if you're using desktop computers, tablets, or a mobile phone, a responsive website will be easily consumable on all of these devices. Now, it's important to understand that responsive web design is not a separate technology. So instead, it is really just a set of best practices and of techniques that we use in our regular CSS. Okay? And speaking of this set of best practices and techniques, let's now actually learn about them. So there are essentially four big ingredients to responsive designs. And those are fluid layouts, responsive units, flexible images, and media queries. Now there might be more, and they might be classified differently, but these are really the big and important ones that you need to know. And so let's start with fluid layouts, which basically allow the web page to adapt to the current viewport width. And this is a behavior that we have already seen in practice a couple of times, especially when we used Flexbox and CSS Grid, which are fluid by default. All right. And we can very easily create fluid layouts simply by using the percentage units for all elements that should adapt to the viewport. So using percentages instead of pixels for all the elements that are usually part of any layout. So things that should really adapt to the viewport should always use percentages and not pixels. Also, we should always use the max width property instead of simply width. And we will learn a little bit about how this one works in the next lecture. Next up, there are responsive units, which basically just means that we should use the rem unit instead of pixel for most of the length that are in our CSS. And using rems instead of pixels will make it really easy for us to basically scale the entire page up or down automatically. And if that sounds a little bit strange, I can show it to you in the next lecture as well. Now here, one helpful trick that I will also show you how to implement in the next lecture is to set one rem to 10 pixels, because that makes it very easy for us to then calculate these length. And again, more about that in the next video. The next ingredient are flexible and fluid images. And this is a separate and important ingredient because by default, images behave different than text content because they do not scale automatically as we change the viewport. Therefore, we need to fix that. So we need to ensure that they do also adapt nicely to whatever viewport the page is viewed at. And usually we simply make images flexible by defining their dimensions in percentages and not using pixels, and also sometimes by using the max width property instead of width. So this one sounds trivial and not important, but actually flexible images is yet another important ingredient of responsive web design. And now, finally, media queries is what brings all the other ingredients together and really brings responsive sites to life. So without media queries, responsive web design would not work at all. And that is because media queries allow us to change styles on certain viewport width, which we call breakpoints. So basically, media queries allow developers to create different versions of a website for different types of devices, because different types of devices have a different width. Now, just keep in mind that media queries alone are completely useless. We really need to start creating a fluid layout from the very beginning. And the same is true for responsive units and flexible images. And in fact, we usually write media queries only at the end of building a certain page or a certain component. And so that's why we will use fluid layouts and responsive units and flexible images in this section, but then media queries, we will only use them in the next section to really make this page responsive. All right. Now, just as a side note, of course, I'm not showing you all of this to scare you or to make you memorize all this information. So this slide is more like a reference for you in the future and also for us to guide us through this project. All right. Now, finally, we also need to talk about the two opposite strategies of building responsive sites with CSS. So the first one is the desktop-first approach, in which we optimize our interfaces for large screens. And so, therefore, we start writing CSS code for these large screens into our main CSS file. Then later, when we actually want to make the website responsive, we simply write media queries in order to shrink the design to fit to smaller screens. This is the more traditional way of doing things, and it's also the easier way to learn, in my opinion. And so, therefore, that's the reason why we will actually use the desktop-first approach in this project. Now, on the other hand, in mobile first, we start writing CSS code for smaller screens in order to basically optimize our layout and our website for mobile small screens. Then, from there, we can move up to larger screens, of course, and again using media queries. So basically, it is the complete opposite of desktop first, right? Now, the idea that's behind this strategy of mobile first is that we, as the designer, really have to think about the mobile experience for our users. And basically, we can do that by reducing our website to the absolute essentials and stripping away everything that is not entirely necessary. And since we live in a mobile world now, this has actually become the more modern way of building websites these days. But again, doing desktop first works just as fine, I think, and it is also way easier for me to show you as a beginner how web development works. So basically how CSS and HTML works with really seeing the results in a large screen. Okay, and that's it. That's basically a short introduction into responsive web design. And so now in the next lecture, we will quickly learn about two of the ingredients a little bit better in CSS. So we're going to learn how the rem unit works and also the max width property.